Yo, what up, my peak diddly dees? This is the original Hood coming to you live, telling you the story about the untold American genocide with the Native Americans. Yo, stay with me. We're going to talk about the settlement of the West, and I'm going to fill you in on the rest of the story. Yo, y'all take care. I'll be right back with you. Alright, well, now we're back here with the story of American genocide. If you see here in the title, that's what we're talking about. Genocide is, as you already know, is wiping out a group of people. Excuse me just a moment. Thank you. I had to readjust my chair. Just making sure you're paying attention. A little different today. So everybody, I hope, is awake. At any rate, this is the end of Native American life in North America, and unfortunately is a sad commentary on Western settlement. First of all, I want to talk about the fact that there was a huge reduction or decrease in the amount of Native Americans in North America ever since European settlement began. If you look here in our notes, it says that there were about 10 million Native Americans during the 1600s. By 1865, which was the end of the Civil War, there were only about 300,000 that remained. Part of the biggest issue was disease, which was kind of the story with Columbus and other explorers in South America and in the Bahamas, West Indies, and that continued into the United States and North America. After the Civil War, most of the Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River were relocated west, and of course you know the story of the Trail of Tears, and that involved Native American, Creek, Choctaw, a number of different tribes here in this area that were forced to go west and generally into Oklahoma area. Um, During the Civil War, the Native Americans that had been forced to go west, for instance, during the Trail of Tears, were kind of left on their own. There were no more soldiers there to protect them, and so there were a number of attacks that went on against a lot of the posts. So a number of American soldiers died as well as a number of Native Americans. So the question is, where are we now? We've been talking about Western settlement. We've been talking about ranchers going west. We've been talking about miners going west. We've talked about farmers going west. The largest group there was farmers. And so they're coming in huge numbers on the Native American land. And so there's a big problem is the fact that the Native Americans already live there. It's their land. They were indigenous to this area, especially in the plains. The Plains Indians, if you recall, the Great Plains is where a number of farmers located, and so now you have these two groups coming together, and part of the issue is that the Plains Indians were nomads. They moved from place to place, and they were hunting buffalo. And so now you have the buffalo, they're moving, they're following their migrations, and farmers are moving to that area. Here's a picture of, you can just see the overwhelming number of bison or buffalo in the area. Here are two Native Americans that are dressed in coyote pelts as they're sneaking up on the buffalo to hunt them. That was a really major part of their culture, a huge part of their whole life. Here's another painting depicting two Native Americans hunting for a buffalo. The buffalo was really integral to their culture. They utilized every part of the buffalo, and so I just can't really put into words to express to you how much a part of their life this nomadic hunting and gathering society was, and to the large degree it was. And so when you have farmers and settlers coming into their territory, that creates problems. And the question is, what does the government do about this? And so essentially what their decision was to wipe out the buffalo. They thought, well, if we can wipe out the buffalo, then we'll be able to essentially wipe out the Native Americans. So they promoted hunting buffalo for various reasons. They allowed ranchers to be on the open ranges, and the idea was they would do that without any competition from buffalo. So of course the ranchers are ready to jump on that. Um, and the idea was that eventually you take away the Native Americans' main food source, and they'd be willing to go on the reservations. General Philip Sheridan was a famous general during the Civil War and famous cavalry general in the West. And in fact, there's a tank named after him that we have in our military today. His philosophy was let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it's the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance. I find this to be a little bit ironic because the word civilization is used, which first of all I hope that would indicate to you the idea that a lot of settlers, white settlers, felt that they were advanced and the Native Americans were savages. And secondly, if you really look at a lot of Native American culture, they were civilized in a lot of ways, although in some cases much more than the settlers coming out to their lands. So now the government is employing market hunters, which were people that were paid to hunt the buffalo, that were marksmen, and so they would hunt the buffalo and sell the hides for $3 a piece. Dodge City was one of the biggest markets there, and then coat makers would take that same hide and make up to $50 off of that coat. So the buffalo became a high commodity, very expensive, and so there were more people willing to come out and kill and hunt the buffalo. Um, on average, these commercial hunters would kill between 2,000 and 100,000 buffalo a day. Um, they were shooting so many of these buffalo in one day that oftentimes they would have to have two rifles. One would be cooling down while they use the other one, and then they would switch those out, which should tell you how often they're firing those weapons. And then they would also hire people that would retrieve the bullets so they could reuse bullets from buffalo carcasses. So it was a big business. It was a big deal. And here is one of the rifles that was used. You notice the sights on the rifle. So these were marksmen. They weren't just having to fire at very close range. And in fact, we'll see in a minute, hopefully, that they were able to hunt by railroad. Here is one of the hunters uh, cutting the pelt off the buffalo, and notice that just leaves the meat here, which was much different than the way the Native Americans portrayed hunting buffalo. The Native Americans used every part of the buffalo, the meat, the hides, the hooves, the horns. They greatly respected the buffalo, and it was just a whole different mindset to the to hunting. Here are some marksmen. I don't know if you can see them here. I'm pointing as they're coming off the trains. Here are some still sitting on the trains. Buffalo are stampeding, running out of the way, and they're just firing at them from the train. Here's another picture showing that. Here's one, two, three of the marksmen there that are just firing. And notice that not only are they on Native American lands, of course, they're ruining an entire habitat, and for those of you taking biology, an entire biome by wiping out the bison. This is actual footage. These are actual pictures of dead buffalo. They're laying in the area there in the Great Plains, which is ironic when you consider that the buffalo today, we look at it as being very strong and powerful. A couple of schools, colleges use that as their mascot. The University of Colorado is the buffaloes or the bison. And so it's just remarkable the difference in philosophy during that time period. This is in 1878, and this is a hide yard. This gentleman right now is sitting on top of buffalo hides, and this is in Dodge City, Kansas, showing 40,000 buffalo hides. So it was big business. In 1870, here's a picture of buffalo skulls that are stacked up. And the reason I'm showing you those is to help you get an idea of just how many buffalo were killed and were hunted in an effort to get the Native Americans to be willing to go on to reservations. During that time, we talked about in the past Wild Bill Hickok, and here's Buffalo Bill Cody. They both had these Wild West shows. Buffalo Bill Cody had the I guess most popular Wild West show in the 1890s, and these are actual Native Americans, and there would be some actual cowboys, and they would restage these little skirmishes and fights between the cavalry and soldiers and the Native Americans, and between cowboys and Native Americans, and they traveled around the East, reenacting these shows. It was a big business, and you might say he was one of the first real promoters during that time period. Here's a broadside or an advertisement for his Wild West show, and so this map really depicts just the astonishing number of buffalo that were wiped out. If you look at the map in the lighter purple areas here, that's where the buffalo were originally located. You can see the different years here, which shows that as we, in the 1760s, they were right here in our area. They were up into Pennsylvania, Ohio, um, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and then as we get closer and closer to this time period in 1889, there are less and less of them because they're being hunted. And finally, you get to this time period, and just these dark areas here are where there are herds of buffalo left. And it's kind of ironic considering that now there's a huge move to bring the buffalo back. This is a video we're going to watch in class, so I'm going to go past this, and hopefully we'll be able to watch this one. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. So the question is, how did the Native Americans respond? At first, they didn't really know what to expect, and then just out of self-protection, they started attacking wagons and stagecoaches and farmers as they came west. And then eventually the government forced them to relocate into reservations in exchange for food or money. Why did they have to go for food or money? Because the government had just wiped out their whole source of food. They weren't farmers. Here they are, these are teepees. These are actual teepees that Native Americans lived in. They weren't used to working the land. They were used to hunting and moving around.
Reservation land given to the Indians was some of the worst in the country. It was difficult to farm, and Indians were no longer able to hunt and fish in the old ways. Making matters worse was that some of the agents who were supposed to provide food and supplies stole them instead. Tribes on many reservations were starving, and the people were becoming angry.
The Indians were desperate. One of the problems that they had was that they could no longer hunt and farm in the old way because they were put onto reservations. They were also promised rations from the government as part of the treaties they had signed, but the rations didn't come. They had no way to provide food for themselves. They went to the Indian agent, and the Indian agent told them to eat grass.
The white agents were cheating us. They broke their treaties. They did not give us what they promised. Our people were starving, and we were very angry.
Thousands of desperate Sioux, angry by the way they were being treated, left their reservations and attacked settlers in what was to become known as the Minnesota Massacre.
They moved out from their reservation, mostly the young men and a few of the elders who were convinced to go along with them, and attacked a lot of the white communities, settlers, and small towns in the region of northwest Iowa, southwestern Minnesota, and part of the eastern Dakotas. They moved from place to place and usually killed everybody they found.
Troops were called in, but by the time they could put the uprising down weeks later, more than 450 people had been killed. One of them was the man who had told the Indians to eat grass. He was found with his mouth stuffed with grass. Eventually, more than 300 Sioux warriors were tried and convicted, including Medicine Bottle and Little Six, two of the leaders. 38 of them were hanged in Lakota, Minnesota, in this country's largest mass execution. More than 1,400 soldiers had to be called in to control the hostile townspeople. It was reported that the Indians sang songs up until the time they were hanged. Reservation land given to the Indians.
Okay, sorry about that. It's a little issue there with the video. Hopefully you're able to hear that one. I'm going to attach this at the end of the video, probably onto SchoolTube or Edmodo, so that you're able to access that. And if you were able to hear it, the biggest thing that I hope you walk away with knowing from that is that there were treaties. It talked about the fact that there were treaties that were broken over and over again. Probably one of the largest great groups of Great Plains Indians that were really a thorn in the side for settlers and for the soldiers was the Sioux Nation, excuse me. And three famous chiefs came from this group: the Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull. I'm sure you've heard of a couple of those at least, probably Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And there were a lot of battles between the U.S. Army, the cavalry scouts, and the Sioux. One was Fetterman's Massacre. The other one was the Sand Creek Massacre. Little Bighorn, which is pretty well known, and then Wounded Knee, which is pretty well known. And Fetterman's Massacre was in 1866, the year after the Civil War ended. And so at this time, the U.S. Army is focusing their attention on building forts along the Gold Trail headed towards Montana. Remember Montana and South Dakota and the Badlands and that area. And Black Hills was a place where gold was discovered. Crazy Horse was a religious and war chief leader there for that group. And so he was essentially facing Captain Fetterman. Here's a picture of Captain Fetterman, and here's a picture of Crazy Horse. Remember, this was Crazy Horse's land that Fetterman was going on to. Fetterman was a little bit cocky and a little bit proud, and he said, with 80 men, I can ride through the entire Sioux Nation. And ironically, his commander, Colonel Carrington, said to him, here he is right here, Colonel Carrington, he said, support the wood train. He was going there was to support the train, relieve it, and report to me. Do not engage or pursue Indians at its expense. Under no circumstances pursue over the ridge. That is Lodge Trail Ridge. Well, of course, Fetterman felt that he was capable of defeating the entire Sioux Nation, and he did not listen. And so a battle ensued against the Sioux, against Crazy Horse. 80 of his troops died, which was his whole unit. And the newspapers reported it as a massacre. A massacre is really when innocent people are killed. And so the question is, why was that word used? And of course, it was used as a means of getting people fired up and disliking the Native Americans and wanting to go to war with the Native Americans. There was report of mutilation. The Sioux really didn't play around. They had had about enough. And so some of the bodies were mutilated with knives. There was a bugler who was the only person that was actually covered by the Sioux because they felt that he was brave, because he actually kept fighting with his bugle to beat off the Sioux warriors, whereas some of the other soldiers begged for mercy. The Sioux were very strong warriors, and they really admired the fact that he was willing to do that. The Sand Creek Massacre, the Native Americans killed up to 200 settlers in Colorado. The governor then, asked them to come to Fort Lyon to surrender or they'd be killed. He led them to believe they would work out a treaty. Chief Black Kettle brought hundreds of the Cheyenne to the fort to make the treaty. And so the Cheyenne made camp at Sand Creek, which was right outside of Fort Lyon. And General John Shivington decided that because they had been attacking settlers, they should be attacked, including their women and children. And so between 69 and 600 Native Americans were killed. And so while they were doing all this, Black Kettle, their leader, was out hunting when everything began. He was a pacifist. He didn't like war. And during this whole situation, he raised the American flag and the white flag and was hoping to end this massacre that was going on, and hoping to still work out some means of working out a treaty, and that was ignored. Shivington was a Methodist minister, ironically, and a Civil War hero. He massacred both women and children of a peacefully camped tribe. He left the army right after this happened, so he couldn't be court-martialed. And here are some testimonies by people that were there, after the incident. It says, I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, mutilated worse than any I'd ever seen before. Women, children, from infants up to warriors. And who did this? It was the United States troops. I'll let you read this one. I'm not going to read that in case some people are kind of squeamish. I do think it's ironic here and probably uh, pretty profound that this was a person that was there that says you call such soldiers Christians, do you? And Indian savages. What do you suppose our Heavenly Father, who made both of them and us, thinks of these things? I tell you what, I don't like a hostile redskin any more than you do, and when they're hostile, I fought them hard as any man. But I never yet drew a bead on a squaw, which was a woman, or a papoose, which was a baby, and I despised the man who would. So that should tell you how bad it was when one of the soldiers would say something like that. And so then there was one last opportunity for peace. In 1867, the Indian Peace Commission was formed, and the idea there was that they would move all the remaining Native Americans onto two large reservations in the Great Plains in the north and the south. Bear in mind, now remember, the Great Plains is, of course, called the breadbasket of the world because of all the farmers and wheat that are there today and that were there shortly after all this took place. And it was doomed for failure for a number of reasons. One is because you're moving a number of different tribes into one area. That would be putting some natural enemies together, which is a major problem. The second one is that none of the leaders could ensure all their people would abide by those rules. Um, the other one is that the settlers and miners didn't follow the rules either and actually went on to reservation land looking for gold and for silver. And also, there was a great deal of corruption. I don't know if you were able to hear in that video. They talked about the fact that a lot of the people that were in charge of running the reservations and getting supplies for the reservations actually were stealing that government money and not buying the food and supplies for Native Americans, and they didn't. So therefore, they didn't get their basic necessities. And one of the guys there said, "Well, let them eat grass." So that was kind of the attitude that was going on. And so then we get it finally. We're going to get into another battle. In 1876, miners began going onto the Sioux Reservation in the Black Hills, which we talked about a second ago. Um, the Americans broke the treaty, and so many of the Lakota went back to they said, well, we can't trust these guys, and went back to hunting buffalo at Little Bighorn Mountain. And so on June 25th, George Custer, who was a colonel, essentially went to bring them back, and he attacked 2,500 Indians or Native Americans. And Custer and his men were becoming overrun. They shot their own horses. They laid behind their horses for cover. In just a second, I'm going to show you a picture of something. And so all 210 of Custer's men, including himself, were killed. Here is a picture of some of the horse carcasses from Custer's men and where they hid behind those and tried to use those for cover. And then, of course, Buffalo Bill and his Wild West show kind of makes this into a spectacular scene. And so this is called Custer's Last Stand. And, of course, you see the Native American is made to look out like the bad guy.
Atrocities were committed by both sides. In 1864, U.S. soldiers attacked a peaceful Indian village near Sand Creek in Colorado, killing 150 Indians. Most of them were women and children, and their bodies were mutilated.
Sand Creek was a massacre because they attacked while it was still dark. They attacked villages of innocent men, women, and children, and they annihilated them and massacred them. And then we all know that they cut scalps, they cut private parts of Indian men, women, and children, and put them on their saddles like trophies.
Even Kit Carson, who had fought the Indians in many battles, spoke out against the brutal attack.
It ain't natural for brave men to kill women and little children. No one but a coward or a dog would do it. All white should be ashamed.
The Sand Creek massacre angered Indians and stiffened their resolve to resist white encroachment, which was becoming 1874, thousands of gold seekers poured onto Indian land in the Black Hills in South Dakota. The Black Hills were given to the Indians as part of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The Indians considered this area sacred, and the U.S. promised that no whites would ever be permitted to enter it. Yet the government did little to stop the gold seekers. To avoid possible hostilities, the government offered to buy the Black Hills. When the Indians refused to sell, the government ordered them onto their reservations. Many refused, so the army sent soldiers into the plains to force them back. Indians were hunted down, and if they refused to surrender, they were killed. One of the officers in charge of hunting down the Indians was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a fearless and brilliant officer who wanted to achieve a spectacular victory over the Indians. Blinded by his ambition for glory, Custer attacked an Indian village without first finding out how many braves he would be up against. What looked like a village of several hundred was actually a summer gathering of tribes numbering as many as 12,000. Custer's men were outnumbered 10 to 1 and were wiped out in less than an hour of frantic fighting in what has become known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
The Battle of the Little Bighorn may have seemed like a major victory for the Indians, but it wasn't. In fact, it was the beginning of the end.
When news of Custer's defeat reached the East, newspapers demanded that something be done.
This was a cold-blooded, barbarous massacre of men. When will the government realize that Indians are not men?
The battle wasn't a massacre at all. Custer and his men had attacked the Indians first.
The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not a massacre by the Indians. It was a battle where Custer came in armed with one of the most highly respected cavalry units in the United States Army. That was the 7th Cavalry, one of the finest fighting units. And General Custer, who was under commission from President Grant, knew that in order to correct the problem, the Indians had to be put on reservations. And so clearly, he sent his best to defeat the Indians, and President Grant's best, which is the 7th Cavalry, were wiped out in a fair fight because he underestimated the strength of the Indians. It is one of the few times that the Indian tribes united against the United States.
One of the Indian leaders that day was Sitting Bull, a great Sioux chief.
All my warriors were brave and knew no fear. The soldiers who were killed were brave men too, but they had no chance to fight or run away. They were surrounded too closely by our many warriors. We did not go out of our own country to kill them. They came to kill us and not kill themselves.
(1876). It is a decade after the Civil War, and America is making its great expansion westward. To clear the way, Native Americans on the Great Plains are being moved to reservations. But one group resists. George Armstrong Custer is sent to move them by force. On June 25th, he leads the 7th Cavalry into a Native American camp along the Little Bighorn River. Every one of his 210 men is killed. not a single soldier lives to tell the tale. But hundreds of books and over 50 feature films recount what may have happened. How the outnumbered men valiantly resist, stubbornly fighting to the last bullet. How Custer and his men die in a brave and noble last stand.
Custer was America's golden warrior, and now he was our martyr on the altar of manifest destiny. The myth of Custer's last stand, that gallant defense against the savage foe of the Western Plains that swept the nation.
So we have this situation. Custer's a hero. He is essentially, well, as you know, he and his men are killed by the Native Americans. Native Americans are looked at as savages, and so we have one last conflict before, essentially the Indian Wars come to an end, and that was at Wounded Knee, which was the last major Indian conflict. What took place was the fact that the Lakota were forced into these tribes, and one of the things they started doing was a dance called the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance was a ceremonial dance that was part of their culture. It was their way of, they were very spiritual people. They felt that they were communicating with their loved ones that had deceased before them. In some ways, many of them believed in the hope that eventually those loved ones would come back. They would overtake the white settlers that were trying to wipe out their way of life. Bear in mind, this had been a way of life that had existed for hundreds of years. Sitting Bull was their leader. He was arrested and accused of leading the dance, which had been outlawed. Some Native Americans tried to stop the arrest. There was a gunfight. Sitting Bull was killed by a police officer who was actually a Lakota also, who was working for the government, and a group of ghost dancers left the reservation. Of course, once they leave the reservation, then they're breaking a treaty. The army attacked them at Wounded Knee Creek, and 200 men, women, and children were killed. These are actual photos from Wounded Knee. Another photo of Wounded Knee. And then, to add even more disrespect to the situation, the government builds these huge pits to bury the people killed at the Native Americans killed at Wounded Knee, which totally went against their type of burial and their type of customs. So it was really a slap in the face to do that. We'll watch this video in class, and that is the end of our session on Native Americans. It was a very tragic period in American history. There are still reservations in place today, and there are some terrible situations there. Alcoholism is a huge deal there. Poverty runs rampant there. When you take a group of people, take away their way of life, force them into a way of life that is not their own, that creates major issues. I'm going to show you some pictures. There was also a movement to try to assimilate Native Americans into the culture. There was a HBO movie that came out a few years ago called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is a very good story of the whole fall of the Great Plains Indians. This is something that someone put together regarding the real Homeland Security, fighting terrorism since 1492. As you know, 1492 is when Columbus came over to the New World, and the first people he met were Native Americans, and since then Europeans have been encroaching on their land, wiping them out with disease, and also starving them, killing them, tried to enslave them. So they've had a pretty rough go of it, thanks to the American settlers. Finally, in 1877, the Dawes Act was passed, which tried to assimilate Native Americans into the American culture. Each family of Indians was given 160 acres and another 40 for their children. It ultimately failed again because the Native Americans were nomads, they were hunters, and now they're expected to become farmers, which was totally against their culture. In 1924, the Act was passed, which allowed Native Americans to become citizens, which is ironic considering they were the first citizens. A few states didn't even recognize that until after World War II, and we'll talk about the Navajo language, which was used during World War II. It was the only code that was never broken by the enemy, which is ironic again. And the Indian Reorganization Act eventually reversed the Dawes Act, or restored ancient lands to Native Americans that could be restored and to their tribes. And so that's why today we still have some reservations. It doesn't work very well, as I said. And then a few years ago, a lot of Native American tribes were allowed to open casinos in order to, I guess, kind of repay them financially for the damage that was done by the government. This is a brochure, or a a broadside of Native American land that was for sale. You notice in each state it lists these western states and western territories and how much land was available, which was just a tremendous amount. So of course that's going to attract farmers there. This was in 1910. These are some Native Americans that were assimilated into American culture. Notice they're dressed just like the white settlers. Their hair, this gentleman's hair is cut short, this gentleman here, this gentleman here. They have some of the same Victorian hairstyles and looks that the white settlers did. So they did try to assimilate into the culture, and they, in many cases, were still treated very harshly and discriminated against. This kind of reverberates the thought that a lot of people had, even though they fought for this land, took land from the Native Americans, they still didn't totally, everyone believe that was the right thing to do. Here, Henry Clay Wood, who was a major in the Army, said, "I recognize the fact that the Indian must yield to the white man simply because there were more white settlers than there were Native Americans." And he says, "But power is not justice, force is not law." So he's essentially saying he realizes it has to be done, but that doesn't make it right. And that's the end of our notes. Thank you. Have a good day.